So the walking and running are kind of the primary locomotor skills that people usually perform, but there also are other locomotor skills that we can observe differences in terms of kind of early stages to proficient stages. So the first three we're going to talk about are jumping, leaping, and hopping. Okay. I just really loved this GIF of this cat hopping through a kitchen, so I included it. But jumping, leaping, and hopping all have different definitions. Okay. So actually, I should have corrected myself in that statement just now, because it's really easy in lay terms to use any of these interchangeably. So I was a good example of what not to do, but the cat is actually an example of jumping. So it's where an individual propels himself off the ground with one or both feet and land on both feet. The landing part is kind of where we get our distinction. So you can see the cat is landing on both feet. Anyways, leaping, on the other hand, is going to be where an individual propels himself off the ground with one foot and then lands on the other foot. So I had mentioned when we talked about running, or the definition of running, is it's kind of a series of leaps, right? You start in a single support phase and you leap on to the other one. So I used a dance example because I love dance. But this is it's called a saut de chat. It's translated from French as step of the cat, and this is a production of Cats. There's a theme here. But they're leaping. You can see she's taking off from one foot, landing on the other one. And then our last example is hopping. Okay, and like I said, big distinction is the landing phase between hopping and jumping. So the individual propels himself off the ground with one foot and lands on the same foot. So hopping, I guess you could say, is a more specific version of jumping. Okay, but you take off on one foot and you land on the same foot, versus jumping, you could take off of one foot or both feet and land on both feet. So just make sure you kind of understand that distinction, because those are important things to know when we start to split up our characteristics of early and proficient jumping and hopping. Okay, so early jumping would look something like the pictures to the right. Okay, and I have different characteristics kind of strewn about within those figures. Simple jumping usually occurs right before the age of 2. So if you think about little kids who like to jump into puddles, stuff like that, right? It happens at a fairly young age. And jumps can be performed either as vertical or horizontal. So the top figure that we have is an example of early vertical jumping, and the bottom figure is an example of early horizontal jumping or long jump. Okay, but the characteristics that exist between the two of these are fairly similar. So regardless if it's intended to be a vertical or horizontal jump, typically you'll notice that the jump is primarily vertical. Right? So in the bottom figure, she's supposed to have a horizontal jump or a long jump, and you can see her trajectory doesn't really get her very far. Typically, there's also an asymmetric takeoff or landing. I think that's best exemplified in the top figure. So you can see that she it looks like she's taking off of one foot a little bit later than the other one, but she also lands on one foot before she lands on the other one. So that's a good example of that characteristic. Full leg and hip extension are not achieved. So in the top image, you can see that her legs aren't extended fully at takeoff, but they're also not extended at the end of her jump either. So we'll see an example of this later, but once the legs extend in a vertical jump, usually they're supposed to stay extended until you land. But also in the horizontal jump example in the bottom figure, legs are not fully extended at takeoff either. And in a horizontal or long jump, the legs also need to extend before landing. So we don't see either of those characteristics in these jump examples. We also just generally tend to have uncoordinated arm movements. So similar to early walking and running, the arms don't really have any directed planar movements. So vertical jump, we kind of describe those as a winging posture where the arms go out to the side or abduct. And the same thing will happen in a horizontal jump as well. And then last but not least, we have no or limited preparatory movements. So the jump just kind of happens. There's not an intentional posturing prior to the jump to give advantage to jump height or jump distance. Okay, so early jumping. As we progress through the lifespan, we can start to observe proficient jumping fairly early on if this skill is encouraged, right? So I've got two figures, and I think both of them pretty clearly outline what the characteristics of proficient jumping would be. So I just let the figures kind of stand alone instead of writing all over the slide. But you can see both of these, both vertical and the long jump, excuse me, have a preparatory crouch, right? And the point of that, if you've taken exercise physiology, I don't know if you guys talk about this in the undergrad ex-phys class, but usually what happens is in the eccentric phase, because you think your calves play a huge role in propelling you off the ground. And the preparatory crouch is kind of similar to strategies that we use with plyometric exercises, where the eccentric phase actually loads energy into your contractile proteins, and so it gives you more power going into the concentric phase of the jump. But the preparatory crouch is intentional to get a higher jump or a longer jump distance. But you'll also notice that there's more coordinated movements of the arms, right, as well as coordinated movements of the legs, and these are going to be different for both vertical and long jump. So I had already kind of mentioned what proficient posture might look like in a vertical jump, where the legs stay extended before all the way up until you actually land. Okay, for the long jump, the legs, hip and knee, right, should fully extend at takeoff, and then you'll get flexion and possible extension just before landing. Specifically in the knees, you would get extension. But I think that kind of depends on how far you're jumping. So, if you look at like Olympic running long jumpers, they usually keep their feet extended, or their legs, not their feet. They usually keep their legs extended in front of their body to get the further jump distance marking in the sandpit. Right? Even if you were looking at a standing long jump or a trained standing long jumper, they keep their legs extended for a little bit longer than novice long jumpers might. Still proficient, both are proficient jumpers, but different movement characteristics based on training. The other last thing I wanted to point out is that both of these should more or less have two-footed landings. Usually we're going to specify, because obviously that's a definition of jumping, is a two-footed landing. But the long jump is actually specified in the image. Vertical jumping, some of you might have had experience using the Vertec and measuring vertical jump height, and oftentimes you will have participants who have a asymmetrical landing pattern. So they'll land on one foot before they land on the other one. And part of that is due to the arm reaching up overhead. So if you measured a vertical jump without kind of that external stimuli to reach as high as you can, you don't create the asymmetry in the body, which will allow the person to land on both feet at the same time. So just another thing to point out as a side note. So that's jumping. again, different from hopping. So jumping, there has to be a landing on 2 feet. Hopping, we have a landing on 1 foot. And the onset of hopping is later than jumping, which makes sense because landing on 1 foot is definitely more difficult and requires a lot more skill and development than landing on 2 feet. Because again, base of support changes, right? So characteristics, I'm going to sound repetitive and I'm really sorry about it, but hopefully it hits home the characteristics you see in early versus proficient stages in all of these locomotor skills. So early hopping, usually the support, oh my gosh, I just realized I had a typo. It's the support limb is lifted, okay? So that's this bottom part here. The support limb is lifted, or support leg is lifted. So I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense the way that the book describes it, but yeah, I'm gonna rephrase. There's not a lot of horizontal movement in an early hopping. I think that's a better way of wording it, and I think I should have thought about that before. I just wanted to try to be more in agreement with the terms in the photo. But the support leg pulls up from the floor, so it's more of a vertical hop than a horizontal hop. Typically hopping, we have a forward motion, and I have some good examples of that in the next slide. But there's not a lot of distance gained. So that's what it means by support leg lifted, not left lifted. My apologies. Okay. The arms are inactive and uncoordinated, very similar to early walking and running and jumping. It's all the same. All these people, they don't know how to use their arms. Okay. But also the swinging leg usually stays in front of the body. Okay, so the hip will stay in flexion and kind of just oscillate in different degrees of flexion instead of moving behind the body, which we'll see in proficient hopping. But I have a video here of this kid, right? And you can kind of see those characteristics expressed. So again, his arms don't really have a coordinated movement. They kind of stay abducted out to the side. He has more of a vertical movement. He's still moving forward, right? But his hop is primarily vertical. And his leg, right, that's off the floor stays relatively flexed in front of his body, okay? So then we can move on to proficient hopping, which we see quite noticeable differences, particularly in the swinging leg. So the swinging leg is going to lead, right, the hip, and it moves through a full range of motion. So what do I mean by swing leg leads hip? It's going to be contributing to pelvic motion in space. So if you were tracking a hop by looking at how far a person's pelvis was being displaced from one location to the next, that swinging leg really helps to support the movement of that pelvic displacement. But also, we notice that the support leg is going to extend fully at the hip. Sometimes we'll get oppositional arm movements to help generate more force so that we have a greater horizontal displacement. And then the support leg is fixed on landing. Okay, so there's a very clear down, up, down, up, down, up pattern. So we'll do some video examples of these. Right, you can see horizontal movement in this individual. You can see a little bit that his arms are moving back and forth in a sagittal plane, right? So they kind of help with that forward movement. And then, where'd my thing go? You can also see that his leg doesn't stay flexed in front of his body, but rather the swinging leg is moving back and forward, okay? Another example would be this dude, okay? So nice visuals for you guys to recognize proficient hopping. Okay. Developmental changes that we might expect to see, more specifically from early to proficient. Usually, fewer children under 3 can hop repeatedly. So you might be able to notice that a person can hop. Like, so if they're under 3 years old, they might display a hopping motion or movement, but they can't continually repeat that movement. So again, that kind of just points to one of the rate limiters that we have with this skill, and the fact that you need to be able to land, balance, and propel off of the same leg. But we also have adaptations of the neuromuscular system, right? So as people develop, they're going to, their brain is going to develop, spinal cord, all of the central nervous system develops as they're growing, right? Especially from infancy to more or less early childhood. So all of those neuromuscular connections are going to help with the control of the movement, especially in generating, voluntary control and moderating voluntary feedback, or moderating feedback in order to incorporate error correction into their movement. But rate limiters are going to be balance of the postural system on one limb. I just mentioned that one. And then also just force generation. Okay, so very similar to how we were talking about being able to propel the body off the ground. If they can't push their body weight up into the air with one leg, they probably won't be able to do hopping. Okay, they also need to be able to recover their balance. So that's the feedback integration I just mentioned. And they need to quickly generate enough force to produce repeated hops. So this is a big reason why we don't usually see repetitive hopping under the age of 3. Okay.